Sometimes a story seems completely airtight. A case is built on powerful emotional testimony, a verdict comes down, and a life is just changed forever. But what happens when a single, forgotten document, a simple pay stub, of all things, shows up years later? Well, this is the story of the payroll alibi, where a little piece of paper didn't just ask some questions, it completely rewrote the truth. So this all starts with the conviction of a young man named Scott Jones. And this case didn't start with a stranger. It started right inside his own home. The accusations were incredibly serious, and they came from his own family, which led to a conviction that would alter the course of his life. Okay, so here's the legal breakdown. Scott was indicted on 5 counts. Now, he was acquitted of rape, but he was found guilty on the 4 other charges. And what's absolutely crucial to understand here is that the entire case, the whole thing, was built on the testimony of his younger sister, Stephanie. It was all about events she said happened over and over in their home. There was no physical evidence, no DNA, it was just her word against his. And this right here? This is the document that made it all official. This police report, filed by Scott's own father, is what turned a family conflict into a full-blown criminal investigation. This piece of paper set everything in motion. At the very heart of the trial was this incredibly specific and very powerful testimony from Stephanie. She described someone coming into her room in the middle of the night, and not just once or twice, but in her words, dozens and dozens of times. It was this repeated nighttime pattern that really sealed the deal for the conviction. But here's the thing, that very specific detail, it's exactly what would later blow the whole case wide open. So years go by, and then something shows up that everybody had completely missed. It wasn't some dramatic last-minute confession or a surprise new witness. No, it was something way more mundane. But, as it turns out, infinitely more powerful. A simple payroll record. And this all boils down to one huge question. If all these terrible things were happening in the family home in the middle of the night, where was Scott? For years, the court had a very clear answer to that, but this pay stub, it offered a completely different one. He was at work. Simple as that. And what's so incredible about this pay stub from the apple peddler is just how objective it is. This isn't someone's memory, right? This is a business record. It's a third-party, timestamped document that says without a shadow of a doubt exactly where Scott Jones was. And check out his job title, Graveyard Manager. Now, that's not just a title. It's basically a built-in alibi. The graveyard shift, as you know, runs from evening until the early morning, the exact window of time the abuse was supposed to have happened. And as the manager, he couldn't just pop in and out. His presence was required. And the evidence just keeps getting stronger from there, because it wasn't just that he was at work. It was the absolutely staggering number of hours he was putting in. The data really paints a picture of a life that was lived almost entirely inside that restaurant. I mean, just look at this number. In January of 1999 alone, Scott, who was just a teenager by the way, worked over 366 hours. Let that sink in for a second. In a month with 31 days, that averages out to almost 12 hours on the clock, every single day. And January wasn't some kind of fluke. As you can see from the data here, month after month, his overtime hours were almost the same, or in some cases, even more than his regular hours. He wasn't just working a job. This job had basically become his entire life. To put it another way, he was clocked in for an average of nearly 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. Just the sheer exhaustion from that kind of schedule alone makes the prosecution's timeline seem incredibly unlikely. Okay, so what we have now is a massive conflict. On one hand, you've got Stephanie's memory, which places Scott in one location. And on the other, you have indisputable payroll data that puts him somewhere else entirely. So let's look at the 2 locations at the heart of this problem. You've got the family home in Toledo, where the abuse allegedly happened, and then you have the Apple Peddler restaurant in the nearby town of Newport, which is where the pay stubs prove he was working. And we're not talking about places that are next door to each other. The drive between the house and the restaurant took anywhere from 30 to 60 minutes each way. So the idea that he was secretly leaving his manager duties, making that round trip unnoticed, night after night, all while working 12-hour shifts, it's just not physically possible. It makes no sense. And when you lay the 2 timelines out, side by side, the conflict is, well, it's undeniable. Around 3 a.m., Stephanie's testimony says an abuser is in her bedroom in Toledo. At that exact same time, the payroll records have Scott Jones on the clock managing staff in Newport. It's impossible for both of those things to be true.
So in the end, it really just comes down to the basic laws of physics. This wasn't about who you believed more or whose memory was better. It was about the simple, undeniable fact that a person cannot be in two different towns at the same time. The payroll data provided an alibi that was quite literally unshakable.
So once you're faced with this physical impossibility, the original story, the one that had sent a man to prison for years, it just started to completely fall apart. And the first domino to fall? The very person who started it all. In a sworn affidavit years later, Scott's father, Ken Jones, admitted his testimony at the trial had been a lie. And his words, they were simple, but they were absolutely damning. I have to recant my testimony. And his affidavit laid out his motivation. He admitted that he was trying to get Scott to use the word penetrate, and that he flat out lied under oath when he claimed Scott had confessed. His reason? He saw his son as an incorrigible child who, in his own words, had to be stopped. Stephanie, now a grown woman, also came forward. She explained that back then, during the trial, she was young, she was naive, and she didn't really understand the legal and medical terms being thrown around. She said she was led to believe something had happened that, as an adult, she now knew had not.
And the courts took notice. I mean, listen to this. A federal judge, after reviewing all of this new evidence, concluded that Stephanie had been led unwittingly into testifying inaccurately. And about what? About events that the payroll records now proved were physically impossible for Scott to have ever committed.
And that's really the core of it, right? That's what makes this payroll alibi so incredibly powerful. The recantations weren't just about people's memories changing over the years. They were forced into the open by the emergence of hard data, objective business records from an accountant that didn't just challenge the story, they disproved it with the certainty of physics. So all of this leaves us with a really fundamental question, one that goes way beyond just this one case. Human memory is powerful, for sure, but we also know it can be flawed, it can be influenced. Data, on the other hand, is cold, it's objective. So when you have human memory on one side and cold, hard math on the other, which one do you trust?